Chapter 1. The Soil Stirs. The village of Oakhaven lay cupped in a shallow valley, a cluster of stone and timber houses huddled as if for warmth against the embrace of the surrounding low hills. Beyond these hills, the land rose into craggy, forested ridges that kept the wider world at a comfortable distance. Life in Oakhaven moved with the rhythm of the seasons, slow and predictable. Mornings arrived with the crow of roosters and the smell of wood smoke. Days were filled with the toil of tending fields, mending fences, or crafting wares. Evenings brought the murmur of conversation from the Sleeping Bear Tavern and the glow of lamplight from windows. Lyra Meadowsweet, her basket heavy with late summer herbs, paused on the path overlooking the village. The air, usually crisp with the promise of autumn, carried a peculiar stillness, a weight that pressed down. She ran a hand over the feathery fronds of yarrow in her basket, its familiar texture a small comfort. For weeks, a subtle disquiet had threaded itself through the warp and weft of Oakhaven's days. It was nothing she could name, nothing tangible, yet it lingered like the scent of unseen rain. Her gaze drifted to Jebediah Plowman's fields, bordering the western edge of the village. Jeb, a man whose spirit was as deeply rooted in the soil as his crops, cultivated the finest sun roots in the valley. These large, golden tubers were Oakhaven's pride, and Jeb's in particular were renowned. This season they were more than renowned, they were excessive. Lyra had seen them. Their green tops, usually robust, were now a lurid, almost aggressive green, thick as a man's arm. And the roots themselves, those she'd glimpsed when Jeb was digging a few for his table, possessed a vibrancy that bordered on the unnatural, their golden hue almost luminous even in dull light. Jeb himself was a fixture in the fields, a broad-shouldered man whose weathered face usually bore a look of grim satisfaction. Today, however, as he hoed between the rows of sun roots, his movements seemed less rhythmic, more agitated. He'd straighten, wipe his brow, and stare at the plants with a mixture of pride and something akin to apprehension. Lyra continued her descent, the path winding down towards the village proper. The scent of damp earth, usually clean and invigorating, now held a faint, almost metallic undertone, something she couldn't quite place. She passed Old Man Hemlock, perched on his usual bench outside the cooperage. He was a relic hemlock, his skin like old parchment stretched over sharp bones, his eyes clouded with age and memories few could fathom. He was muttering to himself, a common occurrence, but the words that drifted to Lyra today caught her attention. She stirs, aye, the deep slumberer turns in her sleep, the soil remembers. Lyra paused. Good morrow, Hemlock, a fine day though the air is heavy. Hemlock's gaze, milky and unfocused, found her. A tremor ran through his frail hand as he clutched the gnarled staff beside him. Heavy, lass, aye, heavy with waiting, the earth. It breathes. Can ye not hear its breath? She offered a polite smile, though a chill traced its way down her spine. The earth always breathes, Hemlock. It gives us life. And takes it, he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. When the hunger comes, when the roots drink deep. He trailed off, his attention snagged by a beetle crawling up his staff. Lyra left him to his ramblings, though his words echoed her own formless unease. She delivered a bundle of feverfew to Mistress Gable for her recurring headaches, and then made her way to her own small cottage at the edge of the woods. Inside, The familiar scent of dried herbs and simmering concoctions was a comfort. She set about sorting her harvest, her mind replaying Hemlock's words. The soil remembers. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, the first tremor came. It was faint, a mere shiver in the earth lasting only a few seconds. Most villagers, busy with their tasks, barely registered it. Some thought a heavy cart had passed, others a distant rock fall. But Lyra, her senses already on edge, recognized it for what it was. The ground itself had moved. Her mortar, half filled with crushed rosemary, vibrated on the table, the pestle rattling against its stone side. She went to her doorway, looking out. A few chickens in the yard squawked, ruffling their feathers. Further down, she saw Bram Kennick, the village headman, step out of his larger house, his brow furrowed. He was a man who valued order and common sense above all. He looked around, saw nothing amiss, and shook his head, likely dismissing it. Jeb Plowman, however, had straightened from his work, his hoe falling to the ground. He stood rigid, staring at his field of sun roots. Even from this distance, Lyra could see the tremor had run through them too. The oversized leaves trembled long after the ground was still. As dusk settled, painting the sky in bruised purples and reds, Lyra couldn't shake the sensation that Oakhaven was no longer resting on solid, dependable earth. The familiar ground beneath her feet felt different, charged with a latent energy. Hemlock's words, the unnatural vitality of Jeb's crop, the subtle tremor, they were disparate threads, but she sensed they were beginning to weave a pattern she did not yet comprehend, a pattern whose outline filled her with a cold, creeping dread. The stillness of the night that followed was profound, too profound, as if the world itself held its breath, waiting. Chapter 2: Whispers from Below. The days that followed the first tremor were marked by a subtle but pervasive anxiety. Oakhaven's routines continued, but an undercurrent of watchfulness ran beneath the surface of daily life. Conversations would hush when someone mentioned the ground's shiver. Eyes would dart to the surrounding hills, as if expecting an explanation to materialize from the silent slopes. More tremors followed, no longer deniable. They came without warning, a sudden lurch that rattled crockery and sent nervous livestock scattering, or a slow, rolling sensation like being on the deck of a ship in a gentle swell. The earth beneath Oakhaven was restless, sighing and shifting like a disturbed sleeper. Patches of ground in the common green began to settle unevenly, creating shallow depressions where none had been before. A section of the old stone wall bordering the graveyard tilted precariously. Jeb Plowman's sun roots became a focal point of village gossip and unease. Their growth had accelerated beyond all reason. The tubers, now partially exposed by the shifting soil, were enormous, some the size of small barrels, their golden skin possessing an internal luminescence that was visible even in broad daylight, a soft, pulsing glow that seemed to mock the sun. The leaves were a dark, almost black-green, and so engorged with sap they dripped a clear, sticky liquid. Jeb, a man who once reveled in his crop's vigor, now tended them with a grim, haunted expression. He built higher fences around his field, not to keep pests out, Lyra suspected, but to keep prying eyes away. "They ain't natural, Lyra," he'd confided in her one morning, his voice low and strained when she'd found him staring at his field, his hands clenched. "They drink too much, grow too fast. It's like the soil itself is force-feeding them. He kicked at a clod of earth. "And the warmth. Come here." He led her to the edge of his field. The air above the sun roots shimmered slightly. Lyra knelt, placing her hand on the tilled earth between the rows. It was unnaturally warm, like a hearth recently banked. A faint, almost inaudible hum vibrated through the soil, a sensation she felt more in her bones than heard with her ears. "It's been like this for days," Jeb muttered, "getting stronger." Lyra straightened, her mind racing. She had consulted her oldest herbals, texts passed down from her grandmother, searching for any mention of such phenomena, any plant sickness or soil condition that could explain it. There was nothing. This was beyond the scope of natural ailments. The warmth, the hum, the accelerated growth, it felt primal, elemental. Old Man Hemlock's pronouncements grew more frequent, his voice gaining a strange clarity amidst his usual ramblings. He would sit on his bench, thumping his staff, his clouded eyes fixed on some distant, unseen point. "The deep slumberer turns," he'd croak to anyone who passed. "She prepares her table. The roots will drink deep of the offered vintage. The season of taking is nigh." Few paid him direct heed, dismissing him as addled. Yet his words, like burrs, clung to the edges of their thoughts. The season of taking, it had a chilling resonance. Unsettling dreams became commonplace. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of visions of endless, dark caverns, of immense, slow-moving shapes, of a hunger that emanated from the very stones of their homes. Ilara Will-o-wisp, the reclusive woman who lived in the woven hut, was seen more often, gathering strange fungi and muttering incantations by the riverbank, her eyes wide and fearful. Bram Kennick, the headman, tried to maintain a semblance of order. He organized work parties to repair the tilted graveyard wall and fill the new depressions in the common. He spoke of unusual geological activity, of shifting water tables, of rational explanations for irrational fears. "We are a sensible folk," he'd declare in The Sleeping Bear, his voice a touch too loud. "We will not be swayed by old wives' tales or the earth playing a few tricks." But his bluster was wearing thin. Lyra saw the worry lines deepening around his eyes, the way his gaze lingered a moment too long on Jeb's glowing fields. He even dispatched Corvus Kettle, the surly hunter, to scout the ridges, looking for any outward sign, fissures, rockslides that might explain the tremors. Corvus returned days later, his usual stoicism replaced by a grim unease, reporting that familiar game trails had vanished, and the very lay of the land in the higher elevations seemed subtly altered, though he couldn't quite articulate how. One evening, as a watery moon cast long, dancing shadows, Lyra was tending her small night garden. The air was thick with the cloying sweetness of the moonflowers, their scent unusually potent. She was kneeling, her fingers tracing the velvety petals of a night phlox, when the ground beneath her gave a distinct lurch. It was sharper this time, accompanied by a low, tearing sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Her breath caught. She scrambled to her feet, heart pounding. A few moments later, a shout arose from the direction of the village well near the central green. Then another, laced with panic. Lyra grabbed her lantern and hurried towards the commotion. A small crowd had gathered around the well. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering light of a few torches, were pale and frightened. Bram Kinnock stood at the edge, peering down into the darkness. "What happened?" Lyra asked, pushing gently through the throng. A young woman, her face streaked with tears, pointed a trembling finger. "The ground. It just opened up. Old Man Abernathy's goat. It was right there and then it was gone." Lyra approached the well. The stone surround was intact, but beside it a jagged fissure had opened in the earth, a black, irregular maw perhaps 5 feet across and of indeterminate depth. A faint, sulphurous odor, mixed with that same metallic tang she'd noticed before, emanated from its depths. The air around the fissure was noticeably warmer. Bram shone his own lantern down, its beams swallowed by the blackness. "A sinkhole," he said, his voice strained but attempting authority. "The tremors must have weakened the ground here. We'll rope it off. Nobody comes near." But as Lyra stared into that unnatural opening, a cold certainty settled in her heart. This was no mere sinkhole. This was a wound in the skin of the world. And something deep below, something vast and ancient, was stirring, its whispers no longer confined to dreams and old men's ramblings, but now tearing their way into the fabric of Oakhaven itself. The season of taking, Hemlock had called it. She feared it was about to begin. Chapter 3. The Watchers on the Ridge. The fissure by the well became a stark symbol of Oakhaven's encroaching dread. Bram Kinnock had it roped off, a flimsy barrier against an unfathomable threat. Villagers skirted it with wide, fearful eyes, the sulphurous warmth a constant reminder of the instability beneath their feet. Abernathy's goat was not recovered. No sound ever emerged from the chasm. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, mingling with the scent of damp earth and an almost cloying sweetness that Lyra suspected emanated from Jeb Plowman's increasingly alien sun roots. It was 2 days after the fissure appeared that Pipkin Moss, the quiet boy who often wandered where others did not, came running into the village square, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended childish fear. He was babbling, pointing towards the western ridge that overlooked Jeb's fields. Men, tall men, no faces, watching. Bram, attempting to soothe the boy, initially dismissed it as an overactive imagination. But Pipkin was insistent, his small body trembling. Lyra, remembering the boy's uncanny drawings, felt a prickle of unease. "Where, Pipkin?" she asked gently. "Show us where you saw them." Reluctantly, Bram agreed to investigate, more to calm the growing unease amongst the onlookers than out of any real belief. A small group formed. Bram, Lyra, a skeptical Jeb Plowman, Corvus Kettle the hunter, and a few other able-bodied men. Pipkin, still shaken, led them out of the village, past Jeb's glowing, pulsating fields and towards the base of the western ridge. The climb was familiar, but the air felt different, charged. The usual woodland sounds, the chatter of squirrels, the call of birds, were muted, replaced by an expectant silence. As they neared the crest, Pipkin stopped, refusing to go further, pointing with a trembling finger. They're still there." Corvus, his hunter's eyes narrowed, moved ahead cautiously. The others followed, cresting the ridge. And then they saw them. Lined up along the exposed spine of the ridge, perhaps a dozen of them, stood what could only be described as figures. They were impossibly tall and slender, their forms vaguely humanoid but elongated, distorted, as if stretched by some unseen force. They were the color of cooling lava, a matte obsidian black that seemed to absorb the light around them. They possessed no discernible features, no faces, no limbs in the conventional sense, just towering, silent monoliths that seemed to have risen from the very rock of the ridge. They were utterly still, yet their presence radiated an intense, cold awareness, a sense of ancient, alien intellect. The Silent Watchers. A collective gasp went through the small group. Jeb swore under his breath, his skepticism vanishing like mist in the sun. Bram Kennick stood frozen, his mouth agape, the color draining from his face. Even Corvus, a man not easily spooked, took an involuntary step back. What are they?" Bram managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. Lyra had no answer. They were like nothing she had ever seen or imagined. They were not of Oakhaven, not of their world. They simply were, their presence a profound violation of the natural order. They did not move, did not react to the villagers' appearance. They merely stood, their unseen gaze fixed on the valley below, on Oakhaven, on Jeb's glowing fields. The sight of them amplified the fear in Oakhaven tenfold. Word spread like wildfire. Panic, once a simmering undercurrent, now threatened to boil over. Villagers locked their doors. Some spoke of fleeing, though none knew where they could flee to escape something that rose from the earth itself and was now observed by these impossible sentinels. Lyra and Bram, after a tense, whispered conference, decided to approach no closer. The sheer alienness of the Watchers, their silent, unwavering vigil, was more terrifying than any overt threat. They observed for a long while, but the figures remained unchanged, unmoving monuments to an unknown purpose. Back in the village, the atmosphere was thick with terror. Jeb Plowman's sunroots pulsed with an almost frantic light, their swollen forms seeming to strain against the soil. He had become fiercely protective, almost manic, patrolling his fields with a pitchfork, his eyes wild. He seemed to believe the Watchers were there for his crop. That evening, old man Hemlock, who had not left his bench, seemed to draw a strange energy from the pervasive fear. His voice, usually weak, gained a surprising strength. He beckoned Lyra closer as she passed, his clouded eyes surprisingly focused. "They have come," he rasped, his gaze fixed on the distant ridge where the Watchers stood silhouetted against the dying sun. "The harbingers, they attend the slumberer when she calls for her due. The tithe stone, it will soon awaken." "The tithe stone?" Lyra asked, kneeling beside him. It was an ancient, moss-covered monolith in the village square, its origins lost to time, its surface covered in carvings no one could decipher. It was mostly ignored, a relic of a forgotten past. Hemlock nodded, his gaze distant again. "The heart of the offering, it calls, and the roots answer." He clutched her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "The legend," my grandmother told it. "When the ground trembles and the Watchers appear and the chosen crop shines with an inner fire, then the great devourer prepares to feed. The earth itself will open its maws." Lyra felt a profound chill. Hemlock's words, no longer mere ramblings, painted a picture of horrifying clarity. The giant beneath them, the harvest, the watchers. It was all part of a terrible, recurring cycle. As if to punctuate his words, a sound reached them from the edge of the village, near Jeb's fields, a wet, tearing sound, followed by a choked animalistic scream, abruptly cut short. Then silence, save for the pulsing hum from Jeb's land and the distant, oppressive stillness of the watchers on the ridge. Lyra exchanged a horrified look with a few nearby villagers who had also heard it. Bram Kennick, his face grim, grabbed a lantern and a stout cudgel. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice tight. "Corvus with me." They moved towards the sound. Lyra, her heart hammering, hesitated only a moment before following, her own lantern casting a flickering pool of light. She had to know. They found the source near the edge of the forest that bordered Jeb's property. A section of Jeb's fence was smashed. In the soft earth, a deep, grotesque furrow had been gouged, as if something immense and powerful had dragged itself from the woods. The furrow was slick with a dark, viscous slime that shimmered faintly in the lantern light. Leading away from the furrow towards the darker depths of the woods were the fresh tracks of one of Jeb's prize pigs, and beside them the drag marks of something else, something that left no distinct prints, only a wide, disturbed trail. The pig was gone. But it was what lay at the beginning of the furrow, half buried in the disturbed soil, that made Lyra's stomach clench. It was a section of something thick and fleshy, the color of raw liver, tubular and glistening. It looked like a severed piece of a colossal root or tendril, and where it had been torn, it oozed the same dark slime. It was undeniably organic and utterly alien. The first of the root maws had made its presence known. The harvest, it seemed, was truly beginning. Chapter 4: The Tithe-Stone Weeps. The discovery of the severed, fleshy tendril and the fate of Jeb's pig cast a pall of tangible dread over Oakhaven. Sleep became a luxury few could afford, punctuated by the recurring tremors and the ever-present, low hum from beneath the earth. The silent watchers on the western ridge remained, unmoving sentinels overseeing the unfolding nightmare. Their presence was a constant, oppressive weight on the village's collective psyche. Jeb Plowman, already unraveling, became a broken man. He abandoned his glowing, pulsating sun roots, no longer able to bear their unnatural vitality or the knowledge of what they attracted. He locked himself in his cottage, emerging only for water, his face gaunt, his eyes darting fearfully towards his fields and the dark woods beyond. The sun roots, untended, seemed to swell even further, their inner light growing brighter, casting an eerie, golden-green glow over the western edge of the village at night. The air around them was thick with their cloying sweetness, and the faint, metallic tang that now permeated everything. Lyra Meadowsweet found herself at the center of the village's fear. Her knowledge of herbs and healing, once a comfort, now seemed inadequate against a threat that defied all natural understanding. Yet people came to her, seeking not just remedies for their frayed nerves and sleeplessness, but also answers she did not possess. She did her best, offering calming infusions and words of strained reassurance, but her own heart was heavy with foreboding. Old Man Hemlock's words about the tithe stone echoed in her mind. The tithe stone. For generations, it had been a mute, moss-covered landmark in the village square, a relic so ancient its original purpose was lost to folklore. Children played around it, villagers rested in its afternoon shadow. Now it drew fearful, sidelong glances. Lyra found herself observing it more closely. The unreadable carvings that covered its surface seemed, in the flickering torchlight of uneasy nights, to writhe and shift. It was 3 days after the pig's disappearance that the tithe stone began to change. Meva Stonecroft, the keeper of village records, was the first to notice. She had been poring over her fragile, leather-bound ledgers, her brow furrowed in concentration, when a low vibration rattled the small table in her cottage. She initially dismissed it as another earth tremor, but this one felt different, more localized, almost resonant. She went to her window, which overlooked the square. The tithe stone was humming. It was a sound akin to the one emanating from Jeb's fields, but deeper, more powerful, a bass thrum that vibrated in the chest. And it was warm. Steam, or perhaps a fine mist, rose from its surface in the cool morning air. The moss that had clung to it for centuries was dry and brittle, flacking away in patches to reveal the stark gray stone beneath. And the carvings, they were no longer faint indentations. They glowed with a faint, internal light, a network of pulsing, vein-like lines that crisscrossed the monolith's surface, mirroring the pattern she had seen in the sky during the strangest auroras. Meva, a woman of pragmatic disposition, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She hurried to find Bram Kennick. By mid-morning, most of the village had gathered in the square, keeping a wary distance from the transformed tithe stone. It hummed with a palpable energy, the glowing lines pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. The air around it was thick and warm. The metallic tang was stronger here, sharp and unsettling. "What does it mean?" a villager asked, his voice barely a whisper, addressing no one in particular. Old Man Hemlock, leaning heavily on his staff, had been brought to the edge of the crowd. His clouded eyes were fixed on the stone, and a strange, almost ecstatic expression was on his face. "It awakens," he rasped, his voice carrying with surprising strength. "The conduit, the heart of the offering. Soon it will call. Soon it will weep." "Weep," Bram Kennick repeated, his skepticism long since eroded by the escalating horrors. "What do you mean, weep?" Hemlock did not answer, his gaze transfixed. Throughout the day, the tithe stone's hum intensified, the glowing veins becoming brighter, their light a sickly yellow-green. The ground around its base grew hot to the touch. Small creatures, insects, field mice, that strayed too close seemed to become disoriented, scurrying in confused circles before collapsing. As dusk approached, the weeping began. From the pulsating, glowing lines of the carvings, a thick, viscous fluid began to ooze. It was the color of dark honey, almost black, and it glittered faintly in the fatting light. It ran down the sides of the monolith in slow, treacly rivulets, pooling at its base before sinking into the thirsty earth. The smell it exuded was overpoweringly sweet, yet with an underlying putrescence, like overripe fruit mixed with something decaying. Villagers recoiled, many gagging at the stench. This was no natural phenomenon. This was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. Lyra watched, her stomach churning. The substance. It reminded her of the sap that dripped from Jeb's monstrous sun roots, but concentrated, intensified. Was this the essence the giant craved? The vintage Hemlock had spoken of? As darkness fell, the tithe stone became a beacon of dreadful light and nauseating perfume. The glowing lines pulsed faster, the dark fluid weeping more copiously. And then the earth around it began to soften. Not just soften, but dissolve. The soil closest to the monolith seemed to lose its cohesion, becoming a soupy, bubbling mire that avidly drank the weeping fluid. The mire began to spread outwards from the stone's base, a slowly expanding circle of liquefying earth. A collective cry of horror went up from the onlookers. This was no longer just a series of strange occurrences. This was an active, aggressive transformation of their village. Suddenly, from the direction of Jeb Plowman's fields, came a new sound, louder than before, a series of wet, tearing, sucking noises, accompanied by the splintering of wood. Lanterns and torches swung in that direction. What they saw sent a fresh wave of terror through the assembled villagers. Moving slowly but inexorably from the edge of Jeb's field, where the monstrous sun roots glowed with feverish intensity, were several more of the root maws. They were larger than the severed piece Lyra had seen, colossal, fleshy tendrils the color of bruised plums, easily 20 feet long, their tips expanding into sphincteric maws lined with what looked like rows of grinding, stone-like teeth. They moved with a horrifying, slug-like deliberation, the ground seeming to liquefy beneath them as they advanced, leaving trails of glistening slime. They were heading towards the village square, towards the weeping tithe stone. "They're coming for it," Lyra breathed, her voice barely audible above the frightened murmurs. "They're coming for the offering." Panic erupted. People screamed, turned to flee, unsure where to go. The ground itself was becoming a trap. Bram Kennick, his face a mask of grim determination, roared above the chaos. "To the church! Get to the church! It's on higher ground, solid stone." The old stone church, situated on a slight rise at the northern edge of Oakhaven, was their most defensible structure. Its foundations, they prayed, were deep and strong. Villagers began to scramble in that direction, some stumbling in their haste, their fear a palpable entity in the night air. Lyra found herself swept along with the crowd, her gaze fixed on the approaching root maws. They moved with an unnerving intelligence, their grotesque forms undulating, their maws gaping, drawn by an unseen force towards the pulsing, weeping tithe stone. The harvest was no longer a creeping dread. It was a monstrous physical reality, and it was consuming Oakhaven from its very heart. Chapter 5: The Church of Last Resort. The flight to the church of St. Reverentia was chaotic. Torches cast wild, dancing shadows on the stone walls of houses as villagers stumbled through the narrow lanes, their cries swallowed by the growing cacophony of the advancing root maws, the sucking, tearing sounds, the low, guttural rumbles that seemed to emanate from their very substance. The ground beneath their feet felt increasingly unstable, punctuated by soft spots where the earth threatened to give way. The air was thick with the tithe stone's cloying, sickening perfume and the metallic tang of something ancient and vast awakening. Sister Agnes Hollow, the village's spiritual guide, stood at the heavy oak doors of the church, her face pale but resolute in the flickering light. She ushered people inside, her voice, usually calm and measured, now strained but firm. "Come, children, find refuge in the house of the Almighty. pray for deliverance. Lyra helped a sobbing mother guide her two small children through the doorway, her eyes scanning the terrified faces that pressed into the relative sanctuary of the church. Old man Hemlock was carried in by two younger men, his body frail but his eyes alight with a terrifying lucidity. Meva Stonecroft clutched a single, precious ledger to her chest. Corvus Kettle stood near the doorway, his axe in hand, his gaze fixed on the advancing horror. Bram Kennick was among the last to enter, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, shouting orders to secure the doors. The heavy oak doors were barred, the thick iron hinges groaning under the strain. Inside, the church was a cavern of shadows and flickering candlelight. The air was cooler here, the scent of old stone and beeswax a faint counterpoint to the encroaching stench from outside. Perhaps 100 souls huddled within, their fear a palpable presence, a collective, ragged breathing that filled the sacred space. From outside, the sounds grew louder. The wet, slithering passage of the root moths, the splintering of wood as they pushed through fences or outbuildings, the occasional dull thud as a dislodged stone from a cottage wall fell. And beneath it all, the incessant, deep hum from the earth, a vibration that resonated through the stone floor of the church, a constant reminder of the colossal entity upon whose skin they unknowingly lived. Pipkin Moss, the boy who had first seen the Watchers, sat near the altar, his small hands covering his ears, his eyes wide and staring. He began to hum, a low, monotonous tune that Lyra recognized as similar to the one she'd heard him hum before, a chilling mimicry of the earth's vibrations. Jeb Plowman was not among them. Lyra scanned the crowded nave, her heart sinking. He had remained in his cottage, a self-imposed prisoner of his own terror, surrounded by the monstrous crop he had cultivated. A sudden, deafening crash from the direction of the village square made everyone jump. It was followed by a chorus of guttural, sucking noises, louder, more intense. "They've reached the tithe stone," Bram said, his voice grim. He peered through a narrow, arrow-slit window. "God's above." Lyra joined him. The view was limited, but she could see the eerie glow from the square. The tithe stone itself was obscured, but the area around it was a writhing mass of dark, fleshy tendrils. The root maws were converging, their massive forms coiling and uncoiling, their maws presumably engorging themselves on the weeping fluid and the liquefied earth. Sister Agnes began to lead a prayer, her voice trembling but clear, reciting ancient verses of protection and supplication. Some villagers joined in, their voices a desperate chorus. Others simply stared, their faces etched with a despair that transcended fear. Old man Hemlock began to laugh, a dry, rattling sound. "The feast begins. The slumberer drinks deep. She will be pleased with this offering." His laughter was cut short by a violent coughing fit. Hours passed in a haze of terror and suffocating tension. The sounds from outside continued, a symphony of grotesque consumption. The hum from the earth grew stronger, the vibrations more pronounced. Dust sifted from the vaulted ceiling of the church. Small cracks appeared in the thick stone walls. Then a new sound began, a rhythmic, heavy thudding against the main doors of the church. Once, twice, then a splintering crack. Corvus Kettle tightened his grip on his axe. They're testing the doors. The thudding came again, heavier this time. A large crack appeared in one of the thick oak planks. The bar creaked ominously. The villagers furthest from the door cried out, scrambling backwards, pressing against the cold stone of the altar. "It cannot be," Sister Agnes whispered, her faith wavering. "This is consecrated ground." Another thud, and the wooden bar across the door splintered, half of it clattering to the stone floor. The doors bulged inwards, held now only by the remaining iron hinges. Through the widening gap, a section of a root maw could be seen, its dark, glistening flesh pressing against the wood, its tip questing, searching. "They're not just after the tithe stone," Lyra realized with a sickening lurch. "The sun roots, the weeping fluid. That was the appetizer. Were the villagers, their life energy, part of the main course? Was the harvest more direct, more personal than they had ever imagined?" The hinges shrieked as the pressure increased. The doors were failing. Bram and Corvus, along with a few other men, braced themselves, ready to meet whatever came through, but their faces showed the futility of their defiance. The silent watchers on the ridge remained, impassive observers of Oakhaven's final agony. The church, once a symbol of sanctuary, was about to become a tomb. The giant beneath them was not just stirring. It was actively, hungrily, reaching for its due. Chapter 6. Dermaglyphs and Desperation. The great oak doors of the Church of St. Reverentia groaned under the relentless pressure. Wood splintered, and the remaining hinges shrieked in protest. Through the widening cracks, the villagers could see the glistening, purple-black flesh of a root maw, its surface pulsing rhythmically. Its blunted tip, like a monstrous probing finger, pushed against the weakening barrier, seeking entry. The air that seeped in was heavy with the cloying sweetness of the tithe stone's effluence and the acrid, metallic scent of the maw itself. Panic, raw and primal, threatened to overwhelm the huddled congregation. Screams tore through the sacred space. Sister Agnes, her face a mask of horrified disbelief, clutched the heavy wooden crucifix from the altar, holding it aloft as if to ward off the abomination. "Begone, foul creature! In the name of the Most High, I command you." The root maw paused, its advance momentarily checked, not by her words, Lyra suspected, but by the sheer density of the remaining wood. Then, with a fresh surge of power, it pushed again. A hinge ripped free from the stone doorframe with a screech of tortured metal. The door sagged inwards. Bram Kennick roared, a sound of defiance mixed with despair. "Stand ready, don't let it in." He, Corvus Kettle, and a handful of other men, armed with axes, pitchforks, and heavy timbers salvaged from broken pews, braced themselves. Lyra watched, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Their courage was admirable, but futile. This was not a beast they could fight with conventional weapons. This was a manifestation of the earth itself, an organ of the colossal entity upon which their village was a mere scab. The remaining hinge gave way. The door crashed inwards, falling flat onto the stone floor with a deafening boom, showering the closest villagers with dust and splinters. Framed in the doorway, its bulk filling the opening, was the root maw. Its tip, now fully visible, was a horrific sphincteric mouth, ringed with what looked like rows of blunt, grinding teeth made of a substance resembling dark, unpolished stone. It surveyed the interior of the church. its movement slow, deliberate, utterly alien. A wave of icy terror washed over Lyra. This was it, the end. Then something unexpected happened. The root maw, instead of surging forward to consume them, recoiled slightly. Its fleshy surface rippled. It seemed confused or perhaps repelled by something within the church. It probed the air with its monstrous tip, then slowly, ponderously began to withdraw from the doorway. A collective, shaky sigh of disbelief went through the church. Had Sister Agnes's prayers, her faith, actually worked? Lyra didn't think so. She looked around, her gaze falling on old man Hemlock. He was propped against a pillar, a strange, faint smile on his lips. In his lap he cradled the bundle of dried herbs he always carried, herbs Lyra had often dismissed as mere trinkets. Now she noticed a faint, almost invisible vapor rising from them, carrying a sharp, pungent aroma that cut through the sweetness of the tithe stone's effluence. Was it possible? Could Hemlock's herbs, some forgotten counteragent, be a deterrent? The reprieve, however, was short-lived. While the root maw at the door had retreated, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble violently. Not the rolling tremors they had grown accustomed to, but sharp, localized jolts. The stone floor of the church cracked, fissures racing across its surface like dark lightning. From outside came new sounds, not the wet slithering of the maws, but a grinding, tearing noise, as if the very fabric of the land was being ripped apart. Villagers cried out as sections of the church wall began to bulge inwards, ancient stones groaning under immense pressure. "What now?" Bram yelled, his face pale. "What in the blighted hells is happening now?" Lyra, her mind racing, remembered Hemlock's fragmented warnings, Meva Stonecroft's unsettling discoveries in the old ledgers. Dermaglyphs, she breathed, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Skin shapers, the land itself, it's moving. As if in confirmation, a huge section of the northern church wall collapsed inwards with a deafening roar, showering the interior with stone and debris. Through the gaping hole, they saw not the familiar Oakhaven night, but a churning, roiling landscape. Hills that had been distant were now pressed against the church. Familiar trees were uprooted, tossed aside like matchsticks. The very ground was contorting, sections of earth rising like slow waves, others sinking into shadowed troughs. The giant was not just sending its appendages. It was reshaping its own skin, and Oakhaven, the church included, was being dragged along, broken apart in the process. The church was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap, being crushed by the living, moving earth. "We have to get out," Lyra shouted, her voice barely audible above the grinding roar and the terrified screams. "The walls won't hold." But where could they go? Outside was a maelstrom of shifting earth and lurking root maws. The decision was made for them. The southern wall, the one facing away from the main advance of the maws, began to buckle. With a groan that seemed to echo the pain of the dying village, it too gave way, creating another jagged opening. Through it, Lyra saw a landscape that was terrifyingly altered but, for the moment, less actively hostile than the churning earth to the north. "That way," Bram bellowed, pointing. "Everyone move, stay together." The villagers, driven by sheer survival instinct, began to scramble towards the new opening. It was a desperate exodus. The floor tilted precariously. Dust filled the air, choking them, stinging their eyes. The light from their few remaining torches cast a hellish glow on the scene. Lyra found herself helping Meva Stonecroft, who had stumbled, her precious ledger skittering across the tilting floor. Old Man Hemlock was lifted by Corvus Kettle, the hunter's grim face set in determination. Sister Agnes, her crucifix still held high, her faith shattered but her resolve to protect her flock somehow intact, guided the terrified children. As they stumbled out of the collapsing church and onto the heaving, alien landscape that had once been Oakhaven's outskirts, Lyra looked back. The Church of Saint Reverentia, their last bastion, was being slowly, inexorably crushed, its stone walls cracking and crumbling as the dermaglyphs, the animated skin of the giant, continued their relentless reshaping. The silent watchers on the distant, now impossibly contorted ridge, remained, their obsidian forms stark against the sickly, glowing sky, impassive witnesses to the village's agonizing demise. The ground beneath their feet was a treacherous tapestry of shifting soil, upthrust rock and gaping fissures that oozed the same dark slime as the root maws. The air was thick with the scent of raw earth, crushed vegetation, and the ever-present, nauseating sweetness of the harvest. They were exposed, vulnerable, a tiny band of survivors on the moving, predatory flesh of an awakened god. Chapter 7. The Whispering Roots and the Humfly's Drone. The escape from the collapsing church led the survivors of Oakhaven onto a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Familiar landmarks were gone, swallowed by the churning earth or grotesquely repositioned. The very ground beneath their feet was unstable, sections of it rising and falling like the chest of a slumbering behemoth, accompanied by deep, guttural sighs that seemed to emanate from the soil itself. The dermaglyphs, those animated sections of the giant's skin, continued their slow, ponderous reshaping of the terrain, their movements creating new hills where valleys had been, and deep, shadowed crevices where paths once lay. Bram Kennick, his face a mask of grim resolve, tried to lead the small band, perhaps 50 souls remained, towards what he hoped was higher, more stable ground. But stable was a relative term in this living nightmare. Lyra, her senses heightened by adrenaline and terror, noticed new, more insidious threats emerging from the tormented earth. The roots of the ancient trees, those that hadn't been violently uprooted, were no longer passive. They writhed like pale, buried serpents, their tips questing, twitching. Some were thick as a man's thigh, others as slender as whipcords, and they whispered. It was not a sound Lyra heard with her ears, but a subtle, sibilant insinuation that slid directly into her mind, a chorus of faint, alluring voices promising safety, rest, and end to the terror. Come closer, rest beneath us. The deep soil is warm. Safe. She saw a young man, his eyes wide and vacant, begin to drift towards a particularly large, pulsing root that had coiled itself around the base of a listing oak. No, Lyra cried, grabbing his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. Don't listen to them. It's a trick. The young man blinked, the vacant look receding slightly. He shuddered, pulling away from the root as if it were red hot. The whispers in Lyra's own mind intensified, seductive, promising oblivion. She gritted her teeth, focusing on the terrified face of a child clinging to Sister Agnes's robe. The whispers were a lure, another aspect of the harvest, designed to draw them into the embrace of the living earth. Old Man Hemlock, carried by Corvus, seemed immune or perhaps attuned to these root whispers. He would occasionally point with a trembling finger. "Not that way. The earth breathes malice there." His pronouncements, once dismissed, were now heeded with desperate attention. As they navigated a particularly treacherous stretch of broken ground, a new horror manifested. From deep fissures that had opened in the earth, fissures that pulsed with a faint, internal heat, emerged swarms of insects. They were the size of Lyra's fist, with multifaceted eyes that glowed with an oily, orange light and iridescent wings that beat with incredible speed, producing a high-pitched, keening drone that vibrated in the teeth and bones. The flies. Their drone was more than just a sound, it was a weapon. It induced a profound nausea, a dizzying vertigo that made it difficult to stand, let alone walk. Villagers clutched their heads, groaning, some stumbling and falling. The air itself seemed to thrum with their oppressive frequency. And then they attacked. They didn't bite in the conventional sense. They swooped down, their drone intensifying to a physically painful pitch, and brushed against exposed skin. Where they touched, a numbing cold spread, followed by a creeping paralysis. Lyra saw a woman cry out as a fly grazed her arm. The arm went limp, useless, dangling at her side. The woman's face contorted in terror as she realized she could not move it. "Cover yourselves," Bram roared, swatting at the air with a broken branch. "Don't let them touch you." The survivors huddled together, using cloaks, blankets, anything they could find to shield themselves from the droning, paralyzing swarms. The flies were relentless, darting in and out, their sheer numbers overwhelming. Lyra felt one brush her cheek. A cold numbness spread instantly, and the side of her face went slack. Panic seized her as she realized she couldn't feel her own skin. Corvus Kettle, with Old Man Hemlock surprisingly light on his back, swung his axe in wide, desperate arcs, crushing several of the insects against trees or the ground. They splattered with a sickening pop, releasing a sharp, acrid odor. But for every one he killed, 10 more seemed to take its place. It was Old Man Hemlock who, in a moment of chilling lucidity, offered a desperate solution. "The fire-sap trees. Their smoke. The old ones knew," he gasped, pointing towards a stand of gnarled, stunted pines that grew on a nearby, still intact rise. These pines, unique to the valley, were known for their highly resinous wood, which burned with a fierce, smoky flame. Bram, seeing no other option, bellowed to the pines, "Get torches burning. The smoke might drive them off." It was a chaotic, stumbling retreat towards the pines, harried by the droning flies. Several more villagers succumbed to their paralyzing touch, falling to the ground, their limbs useless, their eyes wide with unspeakable terror. They had to be left behind. Lyra felt a pang of guilt and horror, but the instinct for survival was too strong. To stop was to die. Reaching the pines, those still able-bodied frantically gathered dry needles and fallen branches. With trembling hands, they managed to coax a few small fires into life. The resinous wood caught quickly, producing billows of thick, acrid smoke. And it worked. The flies, visibly agitated by the smoke, veered away from its densest clouds. Their droning lessened in intensity. The swarms did not disperse entirely, but they kept a wary distance from the choking, eye-watering smoke. The survivors huddled around the fires, coughing, their eyes streaming but alive. The paralysis from the humfly touches seemed to be temporary, the numbness slowly receding, though a deep, aching cold remained in the affected limbs. Lyra could feel her cheek tingling as sensation returned, a painful pins and needles feeling. They had survived another wave of the harvest's horrors, but the cost was mounting. Their numbers were dwindling. Their sanctuary was a small, smoky patch of ground on a heaving, predatory landscape. The whispering roots still twisted in the earth around them, their insidious voices a constant temptation. The dermaglyphs continued their slow, relentless reshaping of the world. And the silent watchers on the ridge, their forms occasionally visible through breaks in the smoke and the contorted terrain, observed it all with their cold, alien indifference. As Lyra looked at the terrified, smoke-grimed faces around her, a chilling thought struck her. The giant wasn't just harvesting a crop. It was testing them, weeding them out, perhaps even playing with them. Each new horror seemed designed to break not just their bodies but their spirits, and the harvest, she knew, was far from over. Chapter 8: The Bloomchild's Offering. The respite offered by the acrid smoke of the firesap pines was temporary and fraught with its own discomforts. The survivors huddled close to the sputtering flames, their eyes raw and watering, their lungs aching from the constant inhalation of smoke. But it kept the worst of the humflies at bay, reducing their relentless, paralyzing attacks to angry, distant drones from the periphery. The whispering roots, however, were undeterred by the smoke, their sibilant temptations coiling around the edges of conscious thought, promising peace in the warm, dark embrace of the earth. Their numbers had thinned. Lyra counted perhaps 30 souls left, a grim testament to the ferocity of the giant's awakening. Among them was Calla, the girl known as the Bloomchild. She was young, no more than 7, with wide, unnervingly calm eyes that seemed to see beyond the immediate terror. She sat quietly beside Sister Agnes, who, despite her shattered faith, still held onto a protective maternal instinct. Near Calla, a single large glow moth, its wings dusted with a faint phosphorescence, fluttered occasionally, its presence a strange counterpoint to the surrounding horror. The girl had been born during a season when the sun roots had bloomed with unusual, almost aggressive fecundity, a precursor, Lyra now realized, to a previous, perhaps lesser, stirring of the giant. As the night wore on, the ground beneath them continued its slow, unsettling undulations. The dermaglyphs ground and shifted in the distance, their movements accompanied by the groaning tear of rock and soil. The metallic tang in the air, mixed with the sweet, rotten perfume of the harvest, was a constant assault on the senses. Sleep was impossible. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the night, a high-pitched, chittering squeal, followed by a man's sharp cry of pain. From the edge of their smoky sanctuary, where a villager named Tompkin had been stationed as a lookout, came a flurry of desperate movement. "Something got him," a voice choked out, "by the legs." Bram, Corvus, and Lyra rushed towards the commotion, their makeshift torches held high. They found Tompkin on the ground, writhing, his face contorted in agony. His legs from the knees down were encased in pale, segmented creatures, each the size of a large rat, with multiple clutching legs and sharp, needle-like stylets plunged deep into his flesh. Sap-seekers. Lyra had seen sketches of similar, smaller creatures in one of her grandmother's oldest, most obscure herbals, described as parasites of deep earth flora. These were monstrously engorged. They were draining him. His skin, where it was visible beneath the clinging bodies of the sap-seekers, was already taking on a pale, desiccated look. Corvus, with a roar of fury, swung his axe, cleaving one of the creatures in two. It burst with a wet pop, spraying a translucent, sticky fluid. The others, startled, momentarily loosened their grip, their chittering rising in pitch. Bram and another man dragged Tompkin back towards the fires, while Lyra and Corvus beat at the remaining sap-seekers with burning branches. The creatures, though repelled by the fire, were tenacious, scuttling with surprising speed, their pale bodies almost luminous in the torchlight. Tompkin was barely conscious, his breath shallow. Where the sap-seekers had been, his legs were shrunken, the skin papery and gray, as if all life had been sucked from them. He moaned, a low, rattling sound. There was nothing Lyra could do. The life sap, the vital essence of him, had been stolen. He died within minutes, his body a horrifying testament to the hunger of the giant's denizens. The attack by the sap-seekers plunged the survivors into a fresh wave of despair. They were being hunted, picked off one by one, their small island of smoky resistance feeling increasingly fragile. It was then that Calla, the Bloom child, stirred. She rose slowly, her small face serene, her eyes fixed on something beyond the firelight. The glow moth on her shoulder pulsed with a brighter light. She began to walk towards the edge of the smoke, towards the darkness where the sap-seekers had retreated. "Calla, no," Sister Agnes cried, reaching for her, but the girl moved with a strange, gliding surety. Lyra and Bram exchanged alarmed glances. "Stop her," Bram ordered. But before anyone could move, Calla raised a small hand. From the darkness, a chorus of chittering arose as the sap-seekers, perhaps sensing fresh prey, began to emerge. The girl, however, showed no fear. She tilted her head as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then she did something extraordinary. She began to hum, a soft, melodic tune, utterly different from Pipkin's unsettling mimicry of the Earth's vibrations. This was a gentle, almost mournful lullaby. As she hummed, the glow moth on her shoulder beat its wings in time with the melody, shedding a cascade of shimmering, phosphorescent dust that drifted around her. The advancing sap-seekers paused. Their chittering lessened. They tilted their grotesque bodies, their multiple legs twitching, as if entranced by the sound and the falling, glittering dust. Calla continued her soft song, her eyes never leaving the creatures. Slowly, almost reverently, she knelt. She reached into a small pouch at her waist, a pouch Lyra hadn't noticed before, and drew out something small and dark. It was a shriveled sunroot, one of Jeb's monstrous crop, but small, perhaps harvested prematurely. She held it out. "For the great sleeper," she whispered, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden stillness. "A small gift, a token of peace." One of the largest sap-seekers, its pale body almost translucent, cautiously approached. It sniffed at the offered root, its antennae twitching. Then, with a delicate precision that belied its horrific appearance, it took the root in its mandibles. It did not devour it immediately. Instead, it turned and, with the root held carefully, scuttled back into the darkness, followed by the rest of the swarm. The chittering faded, replaced by the oppressive silence of the heaving earth. The survivors stared in stunned disbelief. The Bloom child, with a simple song and a shriveled root, had turned back a tide of monsters. Calla rose, her face still serene, though Lyra thought she saw a flicker of profound weariness in the girl's eyes. The glowmoth settled back onto her shoulder, its light dimming slightly. They listened to her, Bram stammered, his voice filled with awe. Sister Agnes rushed to Calla, enveloping her in a hug. "Child, what was that? How did you?" Calla looked up at her, her expression strangely adult. They were hungry. The great sleeper is always hungry, but sometimes a small gift is enough, for a little while. Lyra felt a shiver run down her spine. A small gift. A token. Calla seemed to possess an innate understanding of this monstrous ecosystem, a connection to the giant and its denizens that bordered on the supernatural. Was she a prophetess, a sacrifice, or something else entirely? The encounter with the sap-seekers and Calla's extraordinary intervention brought a new, complex dynamic to their desperate situation. The child, once perhaps seen as just another burden, now represented a sliver of hope, a potential key to understanding, perhaps even appeasing, the forces that sought to consume them. But it was a fragile hope, resting on the shoulders of a 7-year-old girl who spoke of the great sleeper with an unnerving familiarity. And the question lingered. What would happen when small gifts were no longer enough? Chapter 9. The Cartographer's Madness and the Shifting Map. The brief peace bought by Calla's offering to the sap-seekers did little to quell the deep-seated terror. The survivors remained huddled around their smoky fires, acutely aware of every shift of the ground, every rustle in the darkness beyond their small circle of light. The air still thrummed with the distant drone of the hum-flies and the insidious mental whispers of the roots. Meva Stonecroft, the keeper of Oakhaven's history, had managed to save only one of her precious ledgers. The oldest one, its leather cover cracked and brittle, its pages filled with faded, spidery script. By the flickering firelight, she pored over it, her brow furrowed, her lips moving silently as she tried to decipher the cryptic entries. Lyra watched her, wondering if any answers to their predicament lay within those ancient pages. Suddenly, Meva let out a small, choked cry. Her eyes, wide with a dawning horror, were fixed on a particular page. "It cannot be. No." "What is it, Meva?" Lyra asked, moving closer. "What have you found?" Meva's hand trembled as she pointed to a section of text. This entry, it speaks of the cycle of unmaking, of the land that drinks life. It describes the watchers, the maws, even the singing swarms that steal the will. It's all here. This has happened before. A cold dread settled over Lyra. How long ago? The dates, they are unclear, reckoned by seasons and celestial events I do not recognize, but it implies many generations, centuries, perhaps millennia. Oakhaven. It seems we are built upon a place of recurring sacrifice. Meva's voice broke. Our ancestors, Did they know? Did they build here willingly as part of some forgotten pact? The implications were horrifying. Their village, their home, was not just an unfortunate victim of a natural disaster. It was a designated feeding ground. Their very existence might have been tolerated, even cultivated, for this very purpose. As Miva continued to read, her distress grew. She turned a few more pages, her eyes darting back and forth. Then she looked up, her face ashen. There is a map, or what seems to be a map, but it's wrong. She held out the ledger. Tucked into a flap inside the back cover was a folded piece of vellum, far older and more weathered than the ledger itself. Lyra carefully unfolded it. It was indeed a map, crudely drawn but clearly depicting Oakhaven Valley, the river, the surrounding ridges. Yet the details were subtly, disturbingly different. The river followed a slightly different course. Certain hills were smaller, others larger. And in the center of the valley, where Oakhaven Square and the tithe stone should have been, there was a large, ominous symbol, a spiral turning inwards, like a hungry maw. "This is not our valley," Bram said, peering over Lyra's shoulder. "Or not as it is. Was." "Look closer," Miva whispered, her finger tracing a faint line on the ancient vellum. "The ink. It's still, damp in places." Lyra touched the line. Miva was right. The ink, ancient as it seemed, had a faint sheen as if freshly applied. And as she watched, horrified, a new line, fine as a spider's thread, began to etch itself onto the vellum, branching off from the river, heading towards a section of the map that represented the area where the church had stood. It moved with a slow, deliberate crawl, like a living thing. The shifting map. Pipkin Moss, the quiet boy who had been staring intently at the map, let out a small whimper. "It knows," he whispered. "The map knows where we are." As if on cue, the ground beneath them gave a violent lurch. A deep, tearing sound ripped through the night, closer this time. One of the fire-sap pines at the edge of their encampment tilted precariously, its roots groaning as the earth beneath it was dragged away. The new line on the map darkened, thickened. "It's not just recording the changes," Lyra realized with dawning horror. "It's predicting them, or guiding them." The map was not merely a document. It was an artifact intrinsically linked to the giant, to the harvest, perhaps even to the consciousness of the entity beneath them. Miva Stonecroft stared at the map, her eyes wide with a terrifying understanding. She began to laugh, a high, thin sound that bordered on hysteria. "The cartographer's curse, my family. We weren't just record keepers. We were attendants, unknowing guardians of its will." She snatched the map from Lyra, her movements jerky, her eyes glittering with a feverish light. "It shows the way to the heart of it." "Miva, no." Bram grabbed her arm, but she twisted away, her strength surprising. She held the map aloft, its lines now visibly shifting, redrawing the landscape around them in real time. "We follow the lines. It's the only way. It leads to the sleeper's breath, to the place where the offering is made complete." Her voice was wild, her sanity clearly unraveling. She was no longer Miva, the careful historian. She was a devotee of the shifting map, a priestess of her family's ancient, terrible burden. She began to stumble away from the group, following a newly formed glowing line on the map that led into the churning darkness, towards a region where the dermaglyphs were particularly active. the ground rising and falling in monstrous, slow-motion waves. "Stop her," Lyra cried. "She'll be killed." Corvus and Bram moved to intercept, but Miva was surprisingly agile, dodging their grasping hands. She cackled, holding the map before her like a shield and a guide. "The lines know. The lines will lead us to salvation or to glorious consumption." She disappeared into the heaving darkness, her laughter echoing back, quickly swallowed by the groaning of the earth. The shifting map, a beacon of insane prophecy, had claimed its keeper. The survivors stared after her, horrified. The map, once a potential source of answers, had become another instrument of the giant's will, another lure into the heart of the harvest. And the lines on its ancient surface continued to move, to shift, redrawing their doom with every passing moment. The ground itself was a labyrinth, and the only guide was madness. Chapter 10: The Marrow Miner's Descent. The loss of Miva Stonecroft to the madness of the shifting map struck another heavy blow to the survivors' morale. The map itself, now presumably clutched in Miva's wandering grasp, had transformed from a potential key into a symbol of their insidious entrapment. They were not merely victims of a natural catastrophe. They were players in a preordained, cyclical drama, their movements perhaps even anticipated by the ancient intelligence beneath them. Their smoky sanctuary among the firesap pines felt less secure than ever. The ground continued its sickening undulations, and the dermaglyphs ground relentlessly in the distance, their slow, colossal movements a constant reminder of the living earth. The whispering roots seemed to probe closer, their sibilant temptations growing more insistent, preying on weakened minds. The humflies still droned at the edges of the smoke, a persistent, nerve-wracking siege. Old Man Hemlock, his strength failing, had fallen into a fitful, murmuring sleep, occasionally crying out fragmented warnings. "The bones! They come for the bones! Deep, deep miners!" His words, though disjointed, sent fresh chills through Lyra. It was near what should have been dawn, though the sky remained a bruised, sickly tableau of unnatural light and shadow, that a new terror began. The ground tremors changed. They became less like rolling waves and more like immense localized impacts, as if giant fists were pounding the earth from below. Each impact was accompanied by a deep, resonant thump that vibrated through their bodies, followed by a grinding, pulverizing sound. "What now?" Bram Kennick muttered, his face etched with exhaustion and dread. He gripped his axe, its edge dulled from hacking at sap-seekers and fending off the unseen. A short distance from their camp, the earth bulged upwards, forming a rapidly growing mound. Soil and rock cascaded down its sides. The mound split open with a sound like cracking thunder, revealing a cavernous, steaming hole. From its depths, a monstrous, pale form began to emerge, heralded by an overpowering stench of damp clay and something indescribably ancient and rotten. It was a marrow miner. The creature was a blind, grub-like behemoth, easily the size of a large cottage. Its skin was a sickly, yellowish-white like something that had never seen the light, and it glistened with a foul slime. It had no discernible eyes, but its head was dominated by a colossal, drill-like proboscis, made of a substance that looked like fused, blackened bone, which rotated with a terrifying, grinding power. Its segmented body moved with a slow, muscular ripple, propelled by countless tiny, clawed legs. The marrow miner ignored the survivors completely. Its emergence was not an attack, but an arrival for a different purpose. It lumbered towards a section of the ridge that had been relatively stable, a place where ancient, weathered rock formations jutted from the earth. What Hemlock might have called the giant's bones. Reaching the rock face, the marrow miner reared up, its immense proboscis whirring with increased speed. Then, with a deafening roar of pulverized rock, it began to drill. Stone shattered, dust billowed, and the creature bored its way into the ridge with horrifying efficiency, disappearing into the tunnel of its own making. The impacts, the grinding, the thumps, continued from within the earth, now muffled but no less terrifying. "Gods preserve us," Sister Agnes breathed, her face ashen. "What manner of abomination is that?" "The marrow miners," Lyra said, her voice hollow, remembering Hemlock's fevered words. "They're not after us. They're after something within the giant, minerals, perhaps its very essence." Several more mounds erupted across the tormented landscape, each disgorging another of the colossal, blind borers. The valley, or what was left of it, became a hellscape of steaming pits and grinding, subterranean activity. The ground shuddered violently as the marrow miners pursued their unseen quarry deep within the earth's crust, their burrowing causing catastrophic sinkholes and new, terrifying fissures to appear without warning. One such fissure opened with a sudden roar perilously close to their camp, swallowing two of the remaining fire-sap pines, and nearly taking a couple of unwary survivors with them. The survivors were forced to move, abandoning their smoky haven. Their choices were limited. The dermaglyph still churned to the north. The whispering roots infested the wooded areas. And now, the marrow miners were turning the very bedrock beneath them into a treacherous, collapsing honeycomb. Kala the Bloomchild pointed towards a relatively undisturbed slope leading upwards, away from the worst of the marrow miners' activity. "There," she said, her small voice cutting through the cacophony. "The air is quieter there." Her glowmoth fluttered, its light pulsing softly. With no better option, Bram agreed. Their retreat was a desperate scramble across heaving, unstable ground, the air filled with rock dust and the stench of the miners' excavations. They skirted gaping, newly formed chasms from which pulsed a strange, geothermal heat and the continued grinding of the unseen borers. As they climbed, Lyra noticed something else. The character of the light was changing. The sickly, bruised luminescence that had suffused the sky was dimming, being replaced by a more focused, intense glow emanating from what appeared to be the highest point of the reshaped valley, a jagged, newly formed peak that hadn't existed a day ago. It pulsed with a rhythmic, internal light like a monstrous, beating heart. The tithe heart, perhaps. The focal point of the harvest, drawing all the stolen energy into itself. Old Man Hemlock, cradled in Corvus's arms, stirred. His eyes, though clouded, seemed to fix on that distant, pulsating peak. "The nexus," he wheezed, "where all flows, to the sleeper's core, a perilous path." Their ascent was slow and agonizing. The slope was steep, littered with loose scree from the miners' activities. Several times, sections of the path gave way, sending showers of rock and debris tumbling into the darkness below. Each survivor was acutely aware that any misstep could be their last. The higher they climbed, the more the nature of the ground changed. The soil became thinner, interspersed with strange crystalline formations that glittered with an internal phosphorescent light. These crystals hummed with a faint energy, and the air around them was noticeably colder. Lyra recognized them from descriptions in Miva's oldest ledger, dream shards, said to amplify, and sometimes manifest the psychic energies of the giant. Pipkin Moss, who had been unnaturally quiet, began to whimper, clutching his head. Too loud. The dreams are too loud. Lyra looked at him with concern. The boy was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. His eyes were unfocused, darting as if watching unseen horrors. The dream shards were clearly affecting him, perhaps more than others due to his innate sensitivity. As they reached a narrow plateau, a brief respite from the treacherous climb, the pulsating glow from the distant peak intensified. Simultaneously, the ground gave a violent, prolonged shudder. From deep below, from the tunnels carved by the marrow miners, came a series of immense, wet, sucking sounds, as if something colossal had just drawn a massive breath or ingested something vast. Then a terrifying silence fell. The grinding of the marrow miners ceased. The distant drone of the humflies faded. Even the whispering roots seemed to hold their breath. The silence was more terrifying than the preceding cacophony. It was a silence of satiation, or perhaps of anticipation for the next phase of the harvest. The pulsating peak glowed brighter, its light casting long, dancing shadows across the ravaged landscape. The giant had feasted on the marrow of its own bones. What would it hunger for next? Chapter 11. The Dream Shards and the Sleeper's Sigh. The silence that followed the marrow miners' apparent satiation was unnerving. The survivors, huddled on the narrow, crystalline plateau, felt exposed, vulnerable. The pulsating light from the distant, newly formed peak, what Lyra now firmly believed was the tithe heart, cast an eerie, throbbing glow over their grim surroundings. The dream shards underfoot hummed with a low, resonant energy, their faint phosphorescence creating a ghostly landscape. Pipkin Moss was now openly weeping, his small hands pressed hard against his temples. Make them stop. The pictures. The terrible pictures. His distress was contagious, seeding fresh anxiety amongst the already traumatized group. Lyra knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Pipkin, what pictures? What do you see? The boy shook his head violently, his eyes squeezed shut. Big, so big, swimming in stars, then falling, burning, sleeping under the cold earth, waiting. His words were fragmented, nonsensical, yet they painted a chilling picture of cosmic desolation and immense, patient hunger. Lyra realized with a jolt that the dream shards were not just passively humming, they were actively transmitting. They were conduits for the giant's own dormant consciousness, its ancient memories, its alien dreams. And Pipkin, with his heightened sensitivity, was receiving the full, unfiltered force of these psychic emanations. Others began to feel it too, though perhaps less intensely. A low murmur of unease spread through the group. People shifted uncomfortably, rubbing their temples, their expressions growing distant, confused. Lyra herself felt a strange pressure building behind her eyes, a kaleidoscope of fleeting, disorienting images and emotions, immense, crushing loneliness, a vast, slow anger, and unquenchable hunger. These were not her feelings. They were alien, invasive. Suddenly, from the direction of the Tithe Heart Peak, came a profound sigh. It was not a sound in the conventional sense, but a wave of psychic and atmospheric pressure that washed over them, immense and sorrowful like the exhalation of a god. The sleeper's sigh. With the sigh came a visible phenomenon. From numerous vents and fissures that had opened across the landscape, particularly around the base of the Tithe Heart, a shimmering, opalescent gas began to rise. It was not smoke. It was too ethereal, too luminous. It drifted on unseen currents, coalescing into slow-moving clouds that began to spread across the ravaged valley. "What is that?" Bram whispered, his voice hoarse, his eyes wide with a new fear. Old Man Hemlock, propped against a crystalline outcrop, his breathing shallow, stirred. His eyes, though milky, seemed to possess a momentary, terrifying clarity. "The breath of the sleeper," he rasped. "Dreams made manifest. Beware, beware the forms it takes." As the shimmering clouds of gas drifted closer, the disorienting psychic pressure intensified. The fleeting images in Lyra's mind became sharper, more coherent, more terrifying. She saw landscapes of impossible geometry, cities of black, basaltic crystal under cold, dying suns. She felt the crushing weight of eons, the slow drift of continents, the birth and death of stars, all experienced through a consciousness that was unimaginably vast and utterly alien. The gas reached them. It had no discernible scent, but where it touched bare skin, it created a tingling, numbing sensation. And then the hallucinations began. They were not individual, they were shared. The landscape around them began to warp and twist in ways that defied physics. The crystalline plateau seemed to tilt and stretch. The distant Tithe Heart pulsed not just with light, but with grotesque, biological forms that shifted and reformed, a colossal eye, a gaping maw, a writhing mass of tentacles. Villagers cried out, pointing at horrors only they could see, or horrors they all saw, their realities merging into a collective nightmare. A man shrieked, swatting at invisible insects that he claimed were burrowing into his flesh. A woman babbled incoherently, her eyes fixed on a point in the sky where she saw a monstrous, winged shape descending. Lyra fought to maintain her grip on reality. She focused on Kala, the Bloom child who sat amidst the chaos with her usual unnerving calm, the glow moth on her shoulder pulsing gently. Kala's eyes were closed, and she was humming her soft, melodic tune, a tiny island of serenity in a sea of madness. The sleeper's sigh was not just inducing hallucinations, it was giving them a terrifying solidity. Lyra saw Corvus Kettle battle a shadowy, vaguely humanoid figure that seemed to coalesce from the shimmering gas, his axe passing through it with no effect. Yet the creature's spectral claws left shallow, bleeding scratches on his arms. Sister Agnes was on her knees, sobbing, surrounded by visions of torment and damnation that seemed to mock her lost faith. The most terrifying aspect was the intrusion of the giant's own alien thoughts and emotions. The survivors were no longer just witnessing its dreams, they were experiencing them. The crushing loneliness, the eons of slumber, the gnawing, cosmic hunger, it threatened to overwhelm their individual identities, to drown them in the vast, cold ocean of the giant's consciousness. Bram Kennick, his face a mask of tormented confusion, stumbled towards a shimmering wall of gas that seemed to promise escape. "The way out," he muttered, his eyes glazed. "Must find the way out." "Bram, no," Lyra cried, lunging for him. "It's not real, it's the gas." She managed to grab his arm, pulling him back just as the section of shimmering gas he was lunging for solidified momentarily into a writhing mass of tendrils, identical to the root maws, before dissolving back into ethereal vapor. He stared at it, his brief delusion shattered, replaced by stark terror. The psychic assault was relentless. Memories not their own flooded their minds. The giant's arrival on Earth as a burning meteor, its slow burrowing into the planet's crust, the long, patient eons of sleep, the periodic awakenings, the harvests that were less about sustenance and more about sensation, a brief, fleeting connection to the ephemeral lives that scurried on its skin. They were, Lyra realized with a profound, soul-crushing horror, little more than a momentary distraction, a fleeting taste, for an entity whose existence spanned epochs. Their sanity was fraying. The line between reality and hallucination was dissolving. The sleeper's sigh was not meant to kill them directly, but to unmake their minds, to render them pliant, perhaps even willing, for whatever came next. The harvest was entering a new, terrifyingly intimate phase. Chapter 12. The Tithe Heart's Call. The onslaught of the sleeper's sigh, the gas that wove nightmares into reality, continued for what felt like an eternity. The survivors of Oakhaven, their minds battered by alien memories and hallucinatory horrors, teetered on the brink of complete mental collapse. The crystalline plateau offered no shelter, the dream shards beneath their feet amplifying the psychic assault. Lyra clung to the small, stable presence of Calla, the Bloom child. The girl's soft, continuous humming and the gentle, rhythmic pulsing of her glow moth seemed to create a tiny pocket of relative sanity in the storm of madness. Lyra focused on the sound, on the girl's calm face, using it as an anchor against the overwhelming tide of the giant's consciousness. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the intensity of the sleeper's sigh began to wane. The shimmering clouds of gas thinned. The shared hallucinations grew less vivid, more transparent. The crushing weight of the giant's alien emotions receded, leaving behind a residue of profound exhaustion and a lingering, echoing loneliness. As lucidity, or a semblance of it, returned, the survivors looked at each other with hollow, haunted eyes. Several were missing, presumably wandered off into the hallucinatory landscape, lost to the giant's dreams. Pipkin Moss lay curled in a fetal position, whimpering softly, his mind perhaps irretrievably scarred. Bram Kennick sat slumped against a rock, his face buried in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking. Even Corvus Kettle, the stoic hunter, looked pale and shaken, the spectral scratches on his arms a chilling reminder of the unreality they had endured. The pulsating light from the Tithe Heart Peak, however, had grown stronger, more insistent. It was no longer just a visual phenomenon. It was accompanied by a deep, resonant thrumming that vibrated through the very rock of the plateau, a powerful, undeniable summons. The Tithe Heart was calling. Old man Hemlock, his breath coming in shallow, rattling gasps, his eyes fixed on the glowing peak, struggled to speak. The culmination, he wheezed, his voice barely a whisper. The offering must be completed at the heart. Completed how? Bram asked, his voice rough, lifting his head. What more does it want from us? Hemlock's gaze shifted to Calla. A flicker of something unreadable, fear, resignation, perhaps even a strange sort of reverence passed through his clouded eyes. The bloom child, she is, the final flower, the purest essence. A horrified understanding dawned on Lyra. Calla, with her strange connection to the giant, her ability to appease its lesser denizens. Was she meant to be the ultimate sacrifice, the choicest part of the harvest, to be offered directly to the tithe heart? Sister Agnes, overhearing Hemlock's words, let out a choked cry and pulled Calla closer, shielding her protectively. No, she is an innocent. We will not allow it. But the call of the tithe heart was becoming irresistible. It was not just a sound or a light. It was a pull, a deep, instinctual yearning that resonated in their very cells. It promised an end to the suffering, a merging with something vast and eternal. It was the siren's song of oblivion, and it was growing harder to resist. Several of the remaining villagers, their wills eroded by terror and the psychic assault, began to rise, their eyes glazed, their movements slow and automaton-like. They started to walk, stumble towards the glowing peak, drawn by its inexorable summons. "Don't go," Lyra cried, but her voice was weak, her own will struggling against the powerful pull. She felt the allure of it, the promise of an end to fear, to pain. It was Calla who broke the spell, at least for some. She stood up, her small face set with a resolve that belied her years. The glow moth on her shoulder pulsed with a sudden, bright intensity. "It is not the end," she said, her voice clear and surprisingly strong. "The great sleeper, she dreams of more than just hunger. She dreams of change." She looked directly at Lyra, then at Bram and Corvus. "The tithe heart calls for an offering, but perhaps the offering can be different this time." Her words, enigmatic as they were, seemed to cut through the fog of the tithe heart's call. Lyra felt the pull lessen slightly, her own will reasserting itself. Bram straightened, a flicker of his old determination returning to his eyes. Corvus gripped his axe, his knuckles white. But many were already too far gone, shambling like sleepwalkers towards the pulsating peak, their faces blank, their movements guided by an unseen hand. "We can't save them all," Bram said, his voice heavy with grief. "But we can't just follow them to our doom." "Hemlock," Lyra said, turning to the dying old man. "Is there any other way, any knowledge from the past?" Hemlock coughed, a racking, painful sound. He fumbled with the bundle of dried herbs in his lap, his fingers weak. "The sleeper, desire sensation, novelty, a new dream." He pressed the bundle into Lyra's hands. These were once used to alter the dream, to guide the offering," a whisper of defiance. His voice faded, his eyes closing. His breathing grew shallow, then stopped. Old man Hemlock, the last link to Oakhaven's forgotten, terrible past, was dead. Lyra clutched the bundle of herbs. They were dry, brittle, their scent sharp and pungent. Could these simple plants truly hold the key to influencing an entity of cosmic scale? It seemed impossible, yet Kala's words, Hemlock's dying gift, they were all she had left. The tithe heart pulsed, its summons growing more urgent. The earth beneath them thrummed with its power. The remaining survivors, Lyra, Bram, Corvus, Sister Agnes, Calla, and a handful of others, perhaps a dozen in all, stood at a precipice. Follow the doomed to the heart or attempt the impossible. To change the nature of the offering, to whisper a new dream into the mind of a sleeping god. Chapter 13. A Whisper of Defiance. The path to the tithe heart was not a path at all, but a treacherous ascent over jagged, newly formed rock and through valleys of shifting, crystalline sand. The air grew warmer, thicker, the thrumming pulse of the heart, a constant, oppressive beat against their chests. The survivors who had succumbed to its call were ahead of them, a straggling line of somnambulists moving with unerring precision towards the pulsating peak. Lyra clutched Hemlock's bundle of herbs. Their sharp, pungent aroma seemed to cut through the cloying sweetness that still hung in the air, a small pocket of clarity in the overwhelming presence of the giant. Calla walked beside her, her glow-moth fluttering, its light a small, steady beacon. The child's serenity was both unnerving and a source of strange comfort. "What did you mean, Calla?" Lyra asked, her voice low. "That the offering can be different." Calla looked up at her, her eyes holding an ancient wisdom. "The great sleeper takes what is given, always, but what if? What if the gift is not just life or fear? What if it is a new story, a different taste?" A new story, a different taste. Lyra thought of the herbs in her hand. Hemlock had said they were used to alter the dream. Could they, somehow, weave a different narrative into the offering? They reached the base of the Tithe Heart Peak. It was a colossal, misshapen mountain of what looked like freshly solidified magma, shot through with veins of pulsating organic light. At its summit, the light was almost blinding, a raw, concentrated nexus of terrifying power. A wide, ramp-like fissure, oozing the same dark, viscous fluid as the tithe stone, led upwards towards the heart of the glow. The somnambulistic villagers were already ascending it, disappearing into the light. This was the giant's maw, Lyra realized with a sickening certainty, the place where the harvest was consumed. Bram Kennick looked at the ascending line of doomed souls, then at the handful of survivors around him. His face was a mask of grief and grim resolve. "If we are to do this," he said, his voice rough, "we do it now, whatever it is." Lyra took a deep breath. She looked at Calla, who nodded almost imperceptibly. She opened Hemlock's bundle. Inside were several types of dried herbs she recognized: dreamweed for vivid visions, sorrowbane for courage, moon petal said to open pathways to other realms. But there was one she did not know, a small, dark, star-shaped leaf with a scent that was both bitter and intoxicating. "These herbs," Lyra began, then hesitated. What were they supposed to do? Eat them? Burn them? Calla reached out and gently took one of the star-shaped leaves. She held it to her lips, then looked at Lyra. "A whisper," she said, "a shared breath, not for us, for her." Lyra understood. The offering was not to be consumed by them, but by the tithe heart itself, somehow infused with the essence of these herbs, and perhaps with their own desperate intent. They approached the ramp. The heat was intense. The thrumming of the tithe heart vibrated through Lyra's bones, threatening to overwhelm her will. She saw the last of the somnambulists disappear into the blinding light at the summit. "Now," Calla whispered. Lyra took the unknown star-shaped leaf, its bitter scent filling her nostrils. She focused all her will, all her desperate hope for survival, for a different outcome, into that small, fragile leaf. She thought of Oakhaven, of its simple life now extinguished. She thought of the terror, the loss, but also of the courage, the resilience. A new story, a different taste. With Bram, Corvus, Sister Agnes, and the few remaining survivors watching, their faces illuminated by the terrifying glow, Lyra and Calla stepped onto the ramp. The dark, viscous fluid sucked at their feet. As they ascended, Lyra held out the bundle of herbs. The intense heat radiating from the tithe heart caused them to smolder, releasing a thick, aromatic smoke. The star-shaped leaf in her hand seemed to vibrate, to grow warm. They reached the summit. It was a vast, circular caldera, and at its center was a swirling vortex of pure, blinding light, the core of the tithe heart. The air crackled with raw energy. This was the conduit, the direct link to the slumbering consciousness of the giant. The smoke from Hemlock's herbs billowed around them, thick and pungent, mixing with the light drawn into the vortex. Calla began to hum, her soft, melodic tune weaving through the oppressive thrumming of the heart. The glow moth on her shoulder pulsed, shedding its shimmering dust, which mingled with the herbal smoke. Lyra, her heart pounding, her will straining against the immense psychic pressure, stepped forward. She held the smoldering bundle and the single star-shaped leaf towards the vortex. She didn't speak aloud, but in her mind she screamed a defiant plea, a desperate offering of a different kind. "Hear us, feel us. We are more than just sustenance. We are memory, we are hope, we are sorrow. Take this and dream a new dream." The star-shaped leaf in her hand ignited, flaring with a brilliant, emerald green light before being consumed, its essence drawn into the vortex along with the herbal smoke and Calla's song. For a moment nothing happened. The tithe heart pulsed, the vortex roared. Lyra felt a crushing despair. It was hopeless. Then the light of the vortex faltered. It sputtered, shifted color from blinding white to a deep, resonant blue, then to a soft, gentle green. The oppressive thrumming lessened, softened, became almost contemplative. The raw hunger that had radiated from it seemed to recede, replaced by something akin to curiosity. The ground beneath them, which had been vibrating with violent power, stilled. The dermaglyphs in the distance ceased their grinding. The whispering roots fell silent. Even the silent watchers on the far ridges seemed to shimmer, to become less substantial. A profound change was occurring. The giant, the great sleeper, had tasted something new. The harvest, for the first time in perhaps millennia, had been altered. Chapter 14. A Changed World. The moments that followed Lyra's desperate offering at the tithe heart were filled with an unnerving, profound stillness. The blinding light of the vortex softened further, its raw power diminishing, its color shifting through a spectrum of muted, almost gentle hues. The oppressive psychic pressure that had emanated from it lifted, leaving behind a vast, echoing quiet in their minds. Lyra, Calla, Bram, Corvus, Sister Agnes, and the few remaining survivors stood on the caldera's edge, exhausted, disbelieving. The ground beneath their feet was solid, unmoving. The air, though still warm, no longer crackled with hostile energy. Calla, her song ended, leaned heavily against Lyra, her small body trembling with fatigue. The glow moth on her shoulder fluttered once, then settled, its light dimming to a soft, steady ember. "Is it over?" Bram whispered, his voice hoarse, his eyes scanning the transformed caldera. No one answered. They did not know. They had thrown their desperate defiance into the maw of a god, and the god had paused. Slowly, cautiously, they descended from the Tithe Heart Peak. The landscape of Oakhaven Valley, or what remained of it, was a scene of utter devastation, a tortured, alien terrain of jagged rock, gaping fissures, and crystalline formations. But the active malevolence was gone. The dermaglyphs were still, now just grotesque, misshapen hills. The marrow miners' pits were silent. Even the air felt different, cleansed of the cloying sweetness and the metallic tang. As they reached the lower slopes, they saw the first true dawn they had witnessed in days. The sun rose over the ravaged eastern ridges, its clean, natural light painting the desolation in hues of gold and rose. It was a sight so normal, so beautiful, it brought tears to Lyra's eyes. The silent watchers on the distant ridges were gone, vanished, as if they had been illusions or constructs of the giant's hunger, now dissolved with its altered state. Over the next few days, the survivors, a pitifully small band, explored the ruins of their world. Oakhaven was obliterated. The tithe stone in the square was shattered, its power extinguished. Jeb Plowman's fields were a barren wasteland, the monstrous sun roots withered into desiccated husks. The church was a pile of rubble. There were no other survivors. They found Meva Stonecroft's body near a deep crevice, the shifting map clutched in her hand. Its lines were now faded, inert, its dark magic seemingly spent. Pipkin Moss, though still withdrawn, slowly began to respond to Calla's gentle presence, the terrible pictures in his mind gradually receding. The giant beneath them did not stir again. The earth remained quiet, peaceful. The harvest cycle for this turn was truly over. But it was not an ending, Lyra knew, so much as a pause, a change in the rhythm. They had offered the giant a new dream. They had whispered a different story into its vast, alien consciousness. And for now, it seemed, the giant was content to ponder this new sensation. The survivors of Oakhaven eventually left the ravaged valley. There was nothing left for them there but ghosts and bitter memories. Led by Bram's stoic resolve, healed by Lyra's resilient care, and guided by Calla's quiet, unnerving wisdom, they journeyed out into the wider world, a world unaware of the colossal, slumbering entity beneath its skin, or the terrible harvest they had narrowly survived. They carried with them the knowledge, the burden of what lay beneath. They knew the giant was not dead merely, considering. The cycle might one day resume, the hunger might return. But they also carried something else, the memory of a desperate act of defiance, a whisper that had, against all odds, changed the dream of a god. And in that, however fragile, lay a sliver of hope for the future, a testament to the resilience of life even in the face of cosmic, indifferent hunger. The world had changed for them, and perhaps in some small, unknowable way they had changed it too. The great sleeper dreamt on, but now, perhaps, Its dreams were tinged with something new, something almost human. The end.